Welcome everyone to East Bay DSA's Capital class. We're broadcasting here from the East Bay DSA office in Oakland, or the Socialist Center here in Oakland. The DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, is sort of a political organization devoted to sort of democratic socialism. So welcome to everyone who's joining here and also who's watching later. And we are in a reading group. And we're actually at the end of a reading group for most of the people here who've been following along. For those of you who are new, you won't get this picture, but we've been using some memes from It's Always Sunny throughout. And we finally reached the end. Most groups, I think, have finished the book or are on the last chapter. Congratulations. And it's just actually a really big accomplishment. We've been working at it for about 9 months, which is really a long time. And it's going to be another 1 month before the final lecture. So, and this is actually the final lecture covering volume 1 of Capital. And the last one is just going to cover volume 2 and 3 and do a bit of an overview of the whole book and what we've come through. So with that, I just wanted to note that, one of the things that Capital is doing is it's starting with this sort of idyllic image of capitalism, right? Commodity exchange. Everything's value is the labor that goes into it. Everyone is equal. Everyone is free. All that's happening is trades, and the trades are based on equal labor for labor, right? So it's all about fairness, Bentham, equality. And part of what Marx is showing is not that this is a wrong image in a sort of classic sense. It's not that these things are lies or untrue, but that actually if you just follow the logic through to its conclusion, you see how it develops, you see why it develops, you end up seeing capitalism also as the very opposite, right? As a bunch of people completely, in a sense, enslaved or underneath a larger social system. This image is from the Matrix, right? All just fuels, all just batteries for the machines, right? We're all just little pools of labor exploited for the greater development of capital, which is not any single person, right? It's sort of this abstract thing. And so part of what is achieved, in this final section and throughout the book is this sort of, it's a powerful argument, I think, right? To not just say you're wrong, but to actually say, based on your own presuppositions, based on your own rules that you defend, if you really follow them through, you see how they turn into their opposite and don't actually achieve their own ends. And so that's sort of where we're arriving here. And with that sort of brief intro, I just want to frame this lecture specifically, which is really going to be about the labor market. It's going to be about the general law of capitalist accumulation, which is chapter 23. And last lecture, we touched on this topic a little bit. The colors aren't coming through quite as clearly in the projecting, but you can see basically we talked about how this idea of the value of labor power, which is also the wages a worker is paid, right? It's the necessary labor. It's all these concepts that we've been discussing, that idea does not fully explain wages. It gives us a general idea, right? And the logic for everyone who's coming in a little late here is that the value of labor power is the cost to produce it, just like any other commodity. But what's the cost to produce labor power? Well, it's people's own reproduction as human beings and being ready to work the next day. And that's actually their means of subsistence. So that's, the rent they have to pay, the food they have to buy, the furniture, housing, et cetera, et cetera. And it's those things that have a definite value on the market. You could say have a price, have a certain amount of labor associated with them, that have a certain amount of money associated with them. And so the value of labor power is sort of this weird, elaborate tie from the wages we get paid per hour, right? At the top there, the apparent price of labor, down to the actual value of labor power, which itself is actually the value of the means of subsistence, which are actually defined by money. And so there's this sort of loose and tenuous connection. And the final step that we're going to be doing in this chapter, in this section, is basically filling that up with a solid block of stone, which is the general law or the regulation of the labor market. And so I just picked this image to sort of give a sense of sort of what's the role of this section of the book. Well, you can imagine it, if anyone knows about the keystone, right? in arches that are designed like this, they're very easy to knock over. They'll just collapse on their own until this last stone piece is put in, and then they become incredibly strong. And so that's sort of what we're doing here. We're putting in this last law or rule, the capitalist regulation of the labor market, which underlies this sort of unknown that we've had throughout the book. Why is the value of labor power actually, you know, what we get paid? Why don't we get paid a little more? Why don't we get paid a little less? What's going on, and how does that fit within this larger system? Um, and so, despite including this image, I also want to go back to an image we've been using throughout the class, which is this image of the onion and Marx building his arguments in layers. I mostly did want to return to this image just to make a joke, which is that finally we have completed the onion and we can now reach for, the general law of capitalist accumulation, which is going to involve a lot of the different pieces that we've discussed throughout the book. So you're going to see those layers come in. And fundamentally, I think in the most basic sense, it's just that under capitalism, wealth and accumulation of capital require and deepen misery and desperation, right? These two are hand-in-hand processes. It's not that eventually we'll grow our way out of desperation. We'll grow our way out of poverty. In fact, poverty is part of the condition of wealth in this social system. I think to pull a quote that Marx himself quotes in the book from John Bellers to sort of capture this idea, it can be an intuitive idea to understand this, right? It's to read here, if one had 100,000 acres of land and as many pounds in money and as many cattle without a laborer, what would the rich man be but a laborer? As the laborers make men rich, so the more laborers there will be, the more rich men. The labor of the poor being the minds of the rich, right? So it's this same logic, which here is sort of being applied to the very earliest stages of capitalism, is true throughout to today, where it's like it doesn't actually mean anything, right, to have a gigantic fortune if there aren't people who will work for you. There's nothing you can do with that money without other people who are working, who are laboring. And so ultimately, wealth and poverty, which pushes us to work and to labor as working class people, go hand in hand. And so that's just the broad overview. But with that, I want to jump back into chapter by chapter, starting with chapter 22. So we're going a little bit back in time, not the general law yet. Chapter 22, how surplus value is transformed into capital. And I actually wanted to start with prepare yourself. Unfortunately, somewhat difficult diagram, which is going even farther back to chapter 21, simple reproduction. And so I just want to walk through this because it's going to be useful to get a little bit of a sense and familiarity with it. It's just basically talking about how capital continues over time as it accumulates. And in simple reproduction, all of the extra surplus value is just consumed by the capitalists as luxury goods. It's consumed as, yachts or really nice handbags or whatever else. But basically, right, you're starting with some initial investment. Like we've described, all of these investments are divided into variable capital, which is going into sort of paying wages, and constant capital, which is going into buying the raw materials, the machines, the means of production that are needed for the actual process. So then you start production, both with the necessary labor and the means of production, and you produce a new set of commodities. And the value of those commodities is embodied, it both carries over that necessary labor, the wages that are paid to the workers. It carries over the value from the raw materials and the means of production. And there's a new value in it, the surplus value from exploitation, from working longer than is strictly needed. And so this is right, like one, if you think in terms of MCM prime, if you remember that, that's one MC transformed into a new C with an M prime there. There's extra money. And so then you just repeat the cycle, right? Once you sell those commodities that are equivalent to the necessary value, that can go right back into new necessary labor, rehiring the same workers the next month. Once you sell the commodities that are equivalent to the constant capital, to the means of production, the raw materials, you use that same money to rebuy the raw materials to pay for maintenance on your machines so that you can continue producing the next month, right? And there's only one piece that doesn't fit into this sort of continued cycle, and that's the surplus value. And that in simple reproduction is just all going straight into luxury consumption. So when we say there's commodities with surplus value, that box of surplus value is those nice handbags. It is all those nice luxury objects that are just consumed by the rich. So sorry, it's a little long there, but just wanted to make sure people had a sense of it because now we're going to go into expanded reproduction, which is actually a relatively intuitive idea in a sense. It's just that instead of taking that surplus value and having it all go to the luxury of the rich, all go to the consumption of the rich, some of it is reinvested in new production. So some of it becomes the food, the housing, et cetera, to hire new workers, to pay new workers wages, and then they buy the means of subsistence. Some of it becomes the machines, the new raw materials, et cetera, that are needed to produce on an even larger scale. And with both of those things, you have new workers available for hire, you have new machines, new raw materials. You can continue the next cycle even larger than you did before. This is the actual accumulation, the expansion of capital. And so, yeah, I'll just say if anyone does want to raise a question because they're feeling really confused, please just raise your hand. But I'll move forward and presume not. So that's chapter 21 and now chapter 22, expanded reproduction. And then the key question is, under this process of expanded reproduction, what determines how quickly capital actually accumulates? Or, if we're reading the newspaper, if we're sort of just engaging with modern society in the way it's talked about, what determines economic growth? That's sort of the question here. How quickly is capital expanding itself? And Marx notes three key causes or factors. It's not saying that these are the only factors possible, but three key ones. The first, he spends a good amount of time making fun of this one a little bit, if you remember, but it's this idea of the abstinence of the bourgeoisie. It's this idea that when the bourgeoisie doesn't just spend all its surplus on luxuries, on handbags, on this other stuff, that's a sacrifice. That's an abstinence that they're making by reinvesting in their own wealth, in their own increasing riches, and that this abstinence is part of what's driving growth. Marx thinks that's a little silly for some of the reasons. These two paintings here. This one is sort of a bourgeois passing of the dowry sort of marriage painting. And you can see it's relatively austere, even though people are wearing pretty nice clothes, but it's relatively austere. The bourgeoisie of this early period sort of prided themselves on a little bit of austerity. On the other hand, here you have a painting that's explicitly making fun of the aristocracy by this same sort of group of bourgeois painters. It's showing them, drunk after a party. The chair is knocked down. Other people are cleaning up for them. There's trash on the floor. These are the people who can't abstain, who just waste. They're wasteful. And so there was this early theory that basically the abstinence of the bourgeoisie increased growth. And Marx says that even though that is not true, right? Because whether they invest in luxury handbags for themselves or a new factory that they own, they're all investing in their own wealth and their own, accumulation. But there is a truth that the bourgeoisie can shift surplus value, can shift profit between their own luxury consumption and reinvestment and growth. They can do that, and it sort of shifts what they spend their money on. The second key factor, perhaps more important, is just the total magnitude of surplus value. So we talked about this, throughout the book, but whether that's pushing the necessary labor down, pushing wages down compared to what they in a sense should be, or making the worker work longer hours, absolute surplus value, the larger amount of surplus value of exploited time there, the larger the total magnitude of surplus value, and thus the more there is to accumulate and to expand growth, right? So that's another key factor. How much total surplus value do you have to divide between luxury and expansion? And then finally, he brings up this point, which is sort of left to the side throughout the rest of the book. So it's sort of nice to see it here. But he brings up that also capital turns the necessaries of life that are set aside for the working class as the labor fund into capital's own accumulation fund. So when when we see someone who's working 3 or 4 jobs, still barely making it by, maybe not making enough to eat, et cetera, these are people who are not getting paid the value of their labor power, the bare minimum they need to reproduce themselves day by day. And as such, part of that value is actually being stolen and being used to accumulate capital even faster. And so that is another way that capital expands, not just righteously, but also by, in a sense, theft. So he finally brings in theft here, even though in the past he sort of assumed everything's traded at its right value. So just to quickly go through those again, right? It's how much the bourgeoisie actually chooses to reinvest in production versus their own luxury. It's the total amount they have rightfully to reinvest, the total amount of surplus value. And then it's additional theft they make from the means of subsistence of the working class. And so that brings us back to this picture, right? So, on the one hand, some amount is just to luxury, some amount is to reproduction. And then if they can shorten the amount, if they can reduce the amount of necessary labor, they can go faster. But one thing I just want to note before we go forward is that we are thinking here about commodities. So if you look at the top right of those columns, production, commodities. When things are produced, they're produced as things. They're not just produced as money. You don't just get a pool of money, right? And so even though capital has sort of incredible powers to produce new things, to shift production, ultimately, there is a path dependency here, right? Once you've made the Hermes handbags, you can't just turn those into industrial robots. Once you've made the industrial robots, they can't just become luxury handbags and luxury goods. And so there is a little bit of a stickiness, a materiality, right? This is material production, and it matters what the capitalists have actually produced, whether they've produced luxury goods or whether they've produced new machines and new things to expand production. You can't just easily turn one into the other. You have to wait and reproduce. So I just want to note that this is still a material world, and it still matters what they're actually making. And with that, we're on to chapter 23, the general law of capitalist accumulation. Okay. So for this one, I'm just going to sort of start with a problem, which I think helps think through what Marx is doing in this section. And basically, he's sort of setting up a problem that he's then going to resolve. And that's that even though, we've talked through this book, capital keeps expanding on an endless cycle of accumulation. If you remember this image from past lecture, right, it's the CMC just keeps growing and growing and growing, more and more profits accumulated, reinvested, larger and larger cycles of production, endless growth. We've heard all these sort of terms. But, is there an issue here? If capital keeps accumulating, sorry for the switch back and forth, where do all these workers come from, right? If capital keeps accumulating, growing, expanding, if this one little workshop of weavers becomes 4, becomes 12, actually 16, where do all these workers come from? And why is it not true that this increased demand for labor as capital accumulates pushes up wages and in fact benefits everyone, and in the end makes the laborer the person who's in control, right? Because they're the ones who are in demand. Why do the wages stay low, stay at the value of labor power, rather than going up and up and up? And this is sort of the question that defines this chapter, you could say. It's how does the capitalist labor market work to keep wages around the value of labor power, despite this potentially rapid increase in the demand for labor as capital expands? And Marx uses, actually, Thomas Malthus as a foil for his own argument. So I am also going to do that a little bit here. Probably people have heard the name Thomas Malthus before, maybe not for some of you, so I'll just go over it briefly. But he wrote on sort of population growth theory, and he did actually present a theory for how the wages of the working class are regulated. And he said, I'm just going to go over it basically here, but if the working class gets paid wages that are higher than the natural level, than what they should be getting to sort of live an austere, poor life, This leads to earlier marriage, larger families, less death because we're eating well, we're living well, and thus population increase. So you give the poor too much, they'll, you know, have too many children. We've maybe heard something like that before. With this increased population, wages go down. That's his argument, right? There's a lot more workers who are competing for the jobs, but maybe more importantly, there's a lot more workers who are trying to pay for all the means of subsistence, the food, the various things they need to live, and that drives the prices up. So wages go down, prices go up, and together these lead to poverty, delayed marriage, smaller families, more death. It's the exact reverse of that first paragraph, population decline. And so, what does this all mean when we put this together, right? It's this sort of cycle of population oscillating around the natural level and the working class always living sort of on the edge of poverty, right? Because if they start getting higher, they reproduce too fast, they bring their own wages down. This is the Malthusian theory of population growth and how it relates to wages, basically, how the capitalist labor market is regulated. And Marx takes one look at this and basically says, what? So when wages get too high, you're telling me capitalists are sitting around, they're like, oh, let's go take a couple generation nap. Well, the workers have babies, and then those babies have babies. And finally, the population catches up with our demand. And that finally brings wages down. This is what's going on. Capital is waiting for population growth, for generations of reproduction to occur. No, right? We've all lived through multiple ups and downs in the economy. We know this is happening on a much faster scale than multiple generations of population growth. Something else is going on here. And so Marx sort of makes fun of Malthus for presenting population growth almost as this like natural, it's like the natural increase in it's like you're monitoring a deer population, or something. And saying instead, we need we need a specific law for how this happens. So what does he say? I set it up like a little bit of a process diagram, if anyone knows what that is. But basically, Marx says, well, actually what happens is that when wages increase, you ask the question you sent, or society asks the question, capital asks the question, are these wages now too high for us to happily continue accumulating and expanding production? And there's really only two answers there. I mean, you could say there's a middling answer, in which case there's a middling result, but for the sake of simplicity, there's only two answers. Either they're not too high. In that case, let's just go. There's no worries about the wages going up a little bit. We're making so many more profits that it doesn't even matter. Accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. On the other hand, let's say the wages are too high. They're starting to threaten profit. They're starting to make it so that you're not actually even exploiting the workers. You start losing money. Well, we're in capitalism here. That means slowing growth. That means crisis. That means recession. People stop investing. They pull back their money. They go under. That means unemployment for the working class. It means that wages fall, and thus it resets the conditions for further accumulation, right? So regardless of which way you go, you arrive back at further accumulation. And I just want to note that another thing that's interesting about this sort of image, right, is that I think probably a lot of us are used to thinking, and there's still some truth to this for sure, that a recession is a problem for capitalism, right? That a recession is a crisis for capitalism. But in fact, even though that is also true, it's a time when people are feeling like they've been, messed with, that things are not going the way they should be, et cetera. It's also actually part of capital's own self-regulation. It reestablishes unemployment and it pushes wages down. And so that's sort of Marx's, you could say, counter to Malthus. And I did want to use an analogy, which is a little funky, but hopefully resonates with people, of just a thermostat, which is like, I think we've all probably had some familiarity with a thermostat, either at the office, at our home, at a department store. But right, when you set the thermostat, that determines what the temperature is. But the temperature is still going to fluctuate. It's not going to be exactly what you set it at all the time, right? It's going to go up. It's going to go down. Maybe you turn on the oven and the whole apartment heats up. Maybe the sun rises and the whole apartment heats up. So the thermostat actually has to constantly work to regulate the temperature. If it gets too high, it works to cool the house, right? If it gets too low, it works to warm the house. It's turning on the AC. It's turning on the heater. And what you end with is the temperature oscillating, but within this sort of narrow band that you've set. And in a sense, this is what Marx is describing here, right? He's saying that capitalism as a system has set what the wages are going to be. And that if the wages start getting too high, there are rules within the system that bring them back down. If they start getting too low, production expands. There are rules that bring it back a little bit to a more higher level. And I sort of like this analogy in part because when I looked at this real value of the minimum wage chart, it even looks a little similar, right? It's the oscillation of the minimum wage within a solid band that basically hasn't changed much over all these years. And so capitalism has its own sort of internal system to reset wages and to regulate wages. And I was going to read this longer quote from Marx to sort of capture this idea. But he says basically, right, this law has been mystified to the point of becoming a natural law. But the law of capitalist accumulation, in fact, expresses that the nature of capitalist accumulation precludes all decreases in the exploitation of labor and increases in labor's price large enough to seriously jeopardize the constant reproduction of the capitalist relation and its reproduction on an ever larger scale. If you actually start pushing up against the very limits of profit and exploitation, that will be precluded. You know, capital will have a recession, unemployment will be created. It's this exact process we talked about. And then to keep reading here, it can't be otherwise in a mode of production where the worker is there to satisfy the valorization requirements of existing value instead of the reverse, where objective wealth would be there to provide the worker with what he needs for his human development. In the realm of religion, people are ruled by a product of their own heads, and it is just so in capitalist production, except that here people are ruled by the products of their own hands. And so, you know, this is actually going back to that fetishism section, if you remember, way back in chapter 1. He has a very similar quote, but now I think we can see it in a new light, right? In religion, we imagine gods, we imagine powers. Sorry to anyone who is religious. I'm doing a cynical religion take right here. We imagine gods, we imagine these powers. Do these really exist? No, they're our own imagination, and yet they come to rule how we behave, what we think is right and wrong, right? So we've created something in our imagination that rules our life. Well, Marx is saying that capitalism is actually the same. Through our production, through the economy we've set up, through the rules and the processes we've set up, we've created a system that controls us, that sets what the wages are, that brings them back down if they get too high, and that is outside of our own direct hands. It exists above us, almost like a god, and controls our own lives. And I just want to note that if you brought this sort of argument to an economist, they would be confused because of the terminology, but they would eventually agree largely with what you're saying because it's actually a well-established fact in a variety of different, you know, economic sort of theories, but I'm going to use this one in particular, the most obvious, I would say, the Phillips curve, that there is this relation between what is called here wage inflation, i.e. higher wages for workers, and unemployment. It's sort of an intuitive, obvious thing. And this is actually one of the key pieces of theory that guides how the Federal Reserve acts and a lot of these things, right? Oh, inflation is getting too high. Well, that's because of wage inflation. It's because workers are demanding too much. If we can pull back the economy, produce some unemployment, it'll bring that wage inflation down. Alternatively, unemployment's too high. We can push the economy forward, but only up until the point where it starts producing wage inflation for workers. So this is actually already a sort of commonly intuitive knowledge of economists that there is this relationship and that capital, you know, speeds up and slows down in order to regulate wages. And so I just want to note that with what we've covered so far, capital is in control, right? Wages are set. Capital is the thermostat. It's in control, but it is still limited by the body of the working class. Capitalist accumulation has to slow down in order to prevent these wage increases, in order to discipline workers and make them accept lower wages, right? And that is the part that it's going to strain against. It doesn't want to have to slow down just because of something else that's not its own desire for profit, right? So capitalist in this image, right, it's on top. It's clearly in control, but who's the bigger person in this image, right? Who's the one who's actually, in a sense, the core of the whole system and process? It's the worker. The capital is actually a small man on the top. And capital does not really accept this situation. It says this is not enough. We won't be limited by the body of the worker, by having to slow down whenever wages start going up. We don't accept it. And actually, we already know what capital does to overcome this type of limit, because it's exactly what we saw in part 4 of the book, which is machinery and large-scale industry, right? So by deploying machinery, by deploying large-scale industry, by having the worker compete with the machine, and so you can throw away the worker and just bring in a new machine, capitalism changes this relationship and actually, creates a situation where, even though I won't say that first image is not true in a sense, there's also this image, right? Where you look on the factory as a worker, you look on the place you walk into when you go to work, and you're like, this is beyond me. This is a gigantic office tower. This is a gigantic factory, This is something that I could never do on my own. It's this gigantic sort of image and collection of capital that's represented by the capitalist. And so what's going on here? Variable capital is replaced by constant capital. In other words, workers are made to compete with machines. They're replaced with machines, and each individual worker becomes more and more productive. And so that's the key second thing that capital uses to bring wages down. And I just wanted to sort of walk through this theoretically to help us think through it. Using one of the sort of same examples that Marx uses, weaving, and just thinking about what actually happens, how does this change work such that constant capital replaces variable capital? So here you can see on the left, the sort of old hand loom weaving, where everything is moved by hand. They are in a complex machine, the same sort of looms that you'll see in many societies across the world. But because it's by hand, it's slow, it's careful, it takes a lot of work. Maybe in a whole day of work, of hard work, you get one roll of linen, right? Now let's take that same production process, but move it forward 100, 150 years to, relatively recent history. Here we have one worker, right? And then we have them tending 6 or 7 machines, 6 or 7 power looms that are powered at this point by motors, right? That are working much, much, much faster than the hand loom, way, way beyond what the hand loom could achieve. And with this situation, in maybe 1 week, you can produce an entire warehouse full of rolls of cloth. And think of all the yarn, think of all the thread, all the raw materials that go into an entire warehouse versus just one roll. So really what we're seeing here, right, is the same one worker, but first here, they're dealing with a relatively simple machine and a small amount of raw material. By this later phase, it's 6 much more complex, much more expensive machines and much, much, much more raw material. So how much more constant capital is flowing through the hands of this second worker, right? And this is really just what Marx pointing out. I think it's a relatively intuitive point that as productivity increases, both because of the more advanced machines and because of the vastly larger amounts of raw material you use, you end up with much more constant capital flowing through your hands as a worker. I will note, right, that even though the amount of rolls of cloth is maybe increasing by 300, 400, 600 times, the value of those rolls is not increasing by as much, right? Because the cloth has become cheaper. Productivity has increased throughout society. Less labor is embodied in each roll. And so maybe the value has only gone up by 2 or 3 or 4 times. So there is a counteracting tendency in that way. But overall, I think it's a very intuitive point, right? That as we replace, in a sense, workers with new machinery, as productivity increases, we're also replacing variable capital with constant capital. A lot more constant capital is moving through the hands of each worker. And Marx takes a little digression here, basically, to talk about what allows this sort of productivity increase. I personally like this section. I think it's maybe a needed corrective today in a funny way that it wasn't back then, you could say. But I do feel like we've reached this time, right, where technology is so unreachable. And a lot of these things are so not understandable to a single person that we don't have this sense that ultimately what is the key driver of productivity growth? What is required for it to develop? Cooperation on a large scale. That's the simple one ingredient that really drives forward most of productivity and growth. Cooperation on a large scale, one, Marx says, right? It allows for the division and combination of labor to be organized in our modern world, right, across the entire globe. It allows for the means of production to be used more economically as a result of their combination. It allows for means of labor physically suited only for collective use. For example, systems of machines to be brought into being. A factory like you have today could never exist 200 years ago. There would not be a large enough market to meet the needs, the goods produced by that factory, right? These are things that can only exist through a large social cooperation. Also, enormous natural forces can be pressed into the service of production. And finally, production process can be successfully transformed into the technological application of scientific knowledge. All of these things are enabled by cooperation on a large scale. And part of the reason capital develops technologically is because it facilitates cooperation on a large scale. By producing, this is like, in a sense, review from past lectures, right? By producing, on the one hand, massive quantities of privately owned capital, and on the other hand, a huge and diversely skilled army of wage workers for hire. So you have vast pools of capital, even more enhanced, right, by banks and credit, that can suck up 1 million, 2 million, 20 million workers in a new enterprise in just 1 year and do something insane. We have cooperation that spans across the entire global commodity market, right? If you're a big company in the US, you're probably buying all sorts of intermediary products from Vietnam, from China, from all these other places. And this cooperation is facilitated in part by the laws of capital, by creating, on the one hand, these giant quantities of private capital and the dispossessed working class who can be sort of coordinated and brought in. This is obviously a despotic system of coordination. We walked through the chapter on the factories, but it is true that capital achieves productivity growth by doing this. And it doesn't just accumulate. Marx covers this in this section too, right? Capital also concentrates. So I just pulled some somewhat recent headlines from the Wall Street Journal here, right? Marvel Technology to acquire celestial AI in $3.25 billion deal. Large tech companies prepare for acquisition spree. Why companies have the urge to merge. And so, right, capital is not just accumulating to grow, it also is concentrating in giant agglomerations very quickly by either acquiring other similar companies or getting a gigantic loan from the bank, et cetera. So it has this ability to really deploy hugely coordinated labor. And you see that in modern technologies that we use every day, right? So this is the image of a microchip fabrication fab factory. And this right here is a 20 to 30 to $40 billion facility, right? It's incredibly technologically sophisticated. Each of those machines is, produced by itself a very sophisticated large-scale factory and company. And so it's only through this concentration and accumulation of capital and the cooperation on a large scale that enables that we can even produce microchips, which, if we had to find an example of both the application of scientific knowledge and vast natural forces being controlled with insane levels of precision, what's the better example in a sense than a microchip, which we all use every day in our phones, et cetera, et cetera. Just a brief detour, pardon me for this, but if you look at, like I was saying, the ecosystem of companies that makes that possible, it's not just the one, TSMC, which we saw that picture of their factory. It's that all of the machines that they buy are produced by maybe one or two incredibly large, ASML equipment manufacturers. And it's that there's these giant companies devoted just to designing the chips. In fact, there's a whole section of companies devoted to producing the software to allow you to easily design the chips. And it's all these pieces fitting together that allow one of these chips to be produced in a sense in the way they are, which, as I said, right, all of us are using every day. So just want to note the way that this cooperation enables this technology, even if to us it seems like it's caused by entrepreneurial genius or something. Not true. Ultimately, though, just to get back to the book, what is going on here? The amount of fixed capital per worker is steadily increasing as productivity increases. And so this is, a rough graph. You can see a log scale of the amount of capital per worker, up, up, up. To see this same trend visually, right, you only need to look at a car factory from the Fordist era and a car factory from recent times. In one, you see a mass of workers sort of ambling around. In the other, you don't see a single worker. Probably they're there. They were asked to leave for the photo, but the fact that it even could be asked to leave for the photo is sort of ridiculous. Oh yeah, there's maybe one guy walking along the side. Um, so this is what we have, right? Capital replaces workers with machines, with constant capital. And through this, it creates a reserve army of labor. It pushes workers out of the factory into the labor market, into the street, and they have to look for new jobs. And of course, this is also one of the big questions of the day, in the US at least, which is what is this newest technological leap going to do to all of our jobs? Where are the AI job losses going to come from? What new skills should we all be trying to fit ourselves into, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the function of technology, you could say. And we already saw this back in, I think, lecture 6. This is part 4 of the book, when we quoted Marx saying, right, machinery doesn't simply act as the unstoppable competition forever about to make the wage labor redundant. For workers, it is a hostile force. Loudly and widely proclaiming it as such, capital uses it accordingly. Machinery is the most powerful weapon for putting down workers' periodic revolts against capital's autocratic rule, strikes, and so on. And so this is, something we've probably seen or maybe experienced, right? It's the areas where workers are demanding the highest wages, where they happen to have more organized power, that capital is most ready to replace them with machines, right? If you're paying workers pennies, if they're, have poverty wages, they're barely scraping by, capital doesn't mind as much. They're like, oh, it's actually sort of expensive to bring in machines there. We're already paying them very little. So its natural dynamic is to introduce machinery in order to battle down the working class. And I did want to just briefly go into what this looks like in terms of value, and just sort of walk through what it means. Because I think, this is a section where I'll say if you've read a lot of Marxist stuff, you're probably like, well, profits must go down, tendency of the rate of profit to fall, et cetera. But I just want to walk through it. That does come in a little bit in volume 3, but for now, we're not there. And in fact, there's no, well, let's walk through this, right? Marx is talking about at the top, early capitalism that starts with a low organic composition of capital. So maybe one half is constant capital, one half is variable capital, and there's a rate of exploitation of, let's say, 50%, which is not a very productive worker, if you think about it. In that situation, the overall profits, right, not just the rate of exploitation, but the profits taking account the total capital, would be 25%. You then go from early capitalism to the late capitalism that we live in today with a high organic composition of capital. Maybe 11/12 of capital are constant capital, our raw materials, our machines, and only 1/12 is the variable capital. But productivity has increased so much, it's pushed down the necessary labor so much, that now the rate of exploitation is 400%. And in fact, overall profits are higher. And so I just want to walk through how these dynamics work, right? Basically, this is in a sense the shift that's happening. Well, are profits definitely higher today than they were back then? No, but they could be. There's not some inherent law limiting or stopping them because the rate of exploitation can also increase. And then I did make this note, not to scale, because just wanted to also take a moment to think about what it would actually look like to scale, right? Which is not just capital shifting its orientation, but a vast accumulation of capital over these centuries of history that has corresponded to a small and controlled increase in the demand for labor. There actually is a lot more labor people working today than there were way back then, but compared to the accumulation of capital, a relatively small and controlled increase in the demand for labor. And you can see that the overall profits, even if it's from 25% to 30%, in terms of the amount, the stock, the total amount, it's gone up hugely, right? And also those profits, those luxury goods, represent a lot more commodities than they did before, right? Because the value of commodities has gone down. So when you put all these pieces together, you just note that, capital has hugely expanded. Part of that expansion is that it, rather than constantly demanding more workers, can regulate its own need for workers by replacing them with machines, by expanding the constant capital rather than the variable capital. And it can still be profitable because by increasing productivity in that way, it increases the rate of exploitation. Um, so we're digressing a little bit here. So I wanted to get back to the key concept of the book, which is exactly the reserve army of labor. Sorry, the key concept of this chapter. So all the things we've discussed so far, right, basically mean that capitalism constantly creates and maintains a reserve army of labor. And this is the defining thing that organizes and coordinates the capitalist labor market. So the reason wages are where they are is because of the way the reserve army of labor is sort of regulated. Um, and yeah, this is a drawing here of people waiting outside the workhouse, the sort of prisons for the poor in Marx's time. Um, sorry. So to do a little review, there are two tendencies that constantly guarantee this reserve army of labor. On the one hand, it's that first thing we mentioned, right? Deceleration of capitalist growth when wages get too high. The image here is Paul Volcker, if anyone knows, the federal chair from the 70s and 80s, who put the whole US and global economy into a deep recession for 10 to 15 years in order basically to regulate wages, bring wages back down, kill inflation. But then on the other hand, capital can also use machinery to free up workers, especially where wages are high. And both of these tendencies together let it continuously regulate, right, the labor market by producing a reserve army of labor. So you could say the machinery part, that's always happening, right? And if for some weird reason that doesn't work, you actually get to a point where in any way capital is threatened by raising wages, well, you always have the backup, create a recession, right? Natural recessionary tendency. And that brings us to the general law of capitalist accumulation, which in a sense is the regulation of the labor market. And this was actually a drawing, I think, made by some UK reading group of Capital, where they all made drawings and posted them online. But I sort of like it, right? But you could see here, right? Capital, it expands, it's investing in new things, more expansion, new means of production. It needs more labor, need more labor willingly and cheap as possible. But as it expands, it also increases productivity, right? It increases the scale, it accumulates, it concentrates. And so in its expansion by fits and starts, there's a contraction of variable capital and a need for less labor. And so your skills are no longer required, right? Disposable human material is produced, a relative surplus army is produced, which can then be sucked up by capital again on the other side. And so, one way of looking at this image is saying capital is controlling both sides of this picture. It's like the thermostat, right? It's when it gets too high, it's doing one thing. When it gets too low, it's doing the other thing. It controls both sides, and thus it's, in a sense, in control of what's going on here. And that is the general law of capitalist accumulation, basically that capital constantly produces and reproduces this disposable human material, this reserve army of labor that allows it to make sure that wages always stay willing, workers stay willing and cheap. Yeah, and let's pause to do a quick question. Looks like that. Yeah. If you let me pause you just because it's not recorded, so I'm going to try to repeat and then answer. But um, the questioner was just saying that, looking at that sort of thermostat analogy, thinking about Paul Volcker, thinking about the era we live in, it seems like they've turned the temperature down on us, right? That like there was this maybe period of sort of glorious capitalism in the right after World War II in the 50s and 60s, where wages were actually going up with productivity, and that came to an end. And now we're sort of in this new era, and I think that is just true. And we'll talk a little bit about it at the end. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's she said it adds the political factor, and that is why I picked the thermostat in part because I wanted there to be someone pressing the buttons up and down. I agree with that. And in this modern era, it's in a sense the Fed. I think. And anyway, I had slides on that I was told to remove because they're not related to the book, and I have to follow my own rules about always sticking to the text and not just bringing in whatever is interesting me. So, but that I think that's true, and we will touch on it a little bit. Um, but yeah, but I did want to shift. It's a good time to have a question because really the next section is a shift to what does this mean for the working class? So Marx sort of shifts from thinking about how does capital regulate the labor market by producing a reserve army of labor to thinking about, well, if this is what capital is doing, what does that mean for working class life throughout, this entire social system, social era? Um, and so fundamentally, right, this is why we said at the beginning, capitalist wealth always comes alongside immiseration and poverty. And this is why, right? It's because capital will produce a reserve army of labor, a surplus population that's poor, that's unemployed, in order to keep wages low. And it does that as part of its own process. And so then Marx sort of goes into and talks about the different types of surplus population. If people read it, they're familiar with that, but I just wanted to go through each of them briefly. So first he talks about the fluid surplus population. And I have a picture here of these are, immigrants coming to America, searching for work, probably very poor European immigrants who lost their jobs or can no longer make a livelihood in, in Ireland or in Germany. And so this, right, is the fluid surplus population. It's people who are unemployed or underemployed, who are seeking work, but in a sense are there's work behind them. They've worked somewhere in the past. They want a job. There's a job maybe next year or a couple years in the future, but right now they're unemployed. They're in a flow state between one job and another. Even if that might take a couple years, it might take a trip across the Atlantic Ocean. They're still in a sense connected to the labor market, you could say. They're going to get a job. That's at least their expectation. This is that fluid surplus population. And you could say this is right, the unemployed today. It's the official unemployment figure in a sense. He then mentions the latent surplus population. And the key example here is the peasantry, right? So this is a huge mass of people who are working, are making a living, could keep on making a living, working their little plot for decades. They're not in any crisis. They're not in a strict sense unemployed, but they're also not strictly attached to the centers of capital accumulation, right? They're like a peripheral, latent pool of peasants who, when capital needs more labor, if wages go up a little bit in the city, the peasants will rush in to fill that. On the other hand, if capital needs more labor and they're not rushing in fast enough, introduce some machinery in the agricultural districts and poverty will push them into the city. And this is a lot of the history of early development of capitalism up actually until the 60s and 70s, when you really see the agricultural population, globally go down to, below 20. In the US and European countries, below like 3 or 2% of the population now works on farms. But for much of the history of capitalism, there has been this sort of latent surplus population that is, can live its own life for as long as is needed, but can also be drawn into production if it's needed by capital. It's not as clear exactly what this would be today, but you can imagine service workers might a little bit fit the same role, right? There's various things that could. And then finally, he mentions the stagnant surplus population. And these are people, right, who have been out of work so long, maybe they're disabled, maybe they've gone crazy, et cetera, that they are just realistically never going to enter back into the workforce, or not without some very dramatic moment, event, intervention. So this is something, we're familiar with today, when we have some of the more serious, like homeless / mental health things throughout our cities, but right, this is actually something that's always been produced by capitalism. It has always produced a section of the surplus population whose misery is so great that it's basically fully separated from the labor market. And I just want to note, working off of these, that a lot of Marxist scholars, I mean, Marx does this, I think, a little bit in the book itself, but a lot of Marxists since Marx's time have used specifically this chapter and this section to talk about how capital reinforces race and gender and some of these things that, are also big questions today. Like, you could say a naive Marxist back in the 1800s would be, capitalism will turn us all into one big proletarian army and one big bourgeois army, and those two will battle, and all other differences won't matter. Turns out that's not what happened, right? I don't think Marx strictly thought that either. But in fact, through these sort of categories, capital produces differences among types of people. And so this is a painting of the Great Migration. People know what that is in the US from the 40s into the 60s, right? Basically a similar story to the peasants in England, actually, right? The sharecroppers in the US South were basically pushed into the industrial cities of the North to meet the production needs of World War II, and then the sort of great economic expansion that came after it. And that dynamic, them being part of this latent surplus population as sharecroppers, is part of what reinforces a racialization in the US, right? It reinforces the difference and the difference in life experience and the difference in circumstance. And then it's not just that, right? But then going into the 80s and the 90s, where there's deindustrialization, there's a slowdown in growth, and these large groups of Black immigrants who then came to these cities are now left in a sort of, you could say, bombed out, right? The inner city ghetto situation. They're a different type of surplus population, which again brings back racialization. The same thing you could say for gendered difference is that, you know, when someone cannot reproduce themselves, that means a different thing when they have kids and are a woman than it does when they're a man often. And that reinforces gender difference, right? So there's a lot of ways in which these sorts of differences in the labor market reinforce race and gender in society. And so that is sort of part of what this is doing in a sense, as you could say, it's reinforcing difference. But I did want to note, just to clarify here, that it's not just that you being a surplus population maybe is part of what makes you racialized. It's also that the labor market itself, even though we're all dependent on it, is incredibly differed. There's a bunch of different little sections of it, right? And those are themselves racialized and gendered, right? If you looking at here, sorry, I don't know if everyone can read, but on one side, it's saying childcare workers are more than 90% women. Pilots are more than 80% men. Other agricultural workers in California are more than 95% Latino, right? So the actual way that the labor market breaks up these little segments of work also reinforces gendered and racial difference. And capitalism, despite making everyone collectively dependent on one labor market, is also always differentiating them in different ways. And that's part of the reason that, you know, I'm not going to say it causes race and gender, but it's part of the reason these things have been reproduced over hundreds and hundreds of years as capitalism has expanded across the globe. Sorry. And so just to say it in the last way, there's like a balance of supply and demand. There's higher and lower wages for different sections, right? So you could imagine the labor market a little bit like this hanging statue thing, right? And some sections of the labor market, let's say that little blue piece at the top there, maybe you're making enough that you have a little bit of savings. Maybe, you know, you can go on a vacation a couple times a year. Maybe you have a retirement account. And then in another section, maybe one of the bottom red ones, you're living paycheck to paycheck. Any little thing would push you over the edge. And despite that, you're barely making enough to like eat. You're not eating well. Right. And so this difference in how people relate to the labor market is part of the labor market. And even though it's all one, in a sense, big connected machine, you could say, it also always is internally differentiated. And Marx even talks a little bit about this, right? Where if certain jobs are in really high demand or have high skill, the wages will go significantly up for those jobs versus others. So I just wanted to note that this chapter, both in terms of the labor market and in terms of surplus population specifically, is sort of a key source for Marxists to think about some of these things in the coming centuries after Marx died. And then I want to get back to the book a little bit and just ask, does this general law that we've laid out describe the world we see in front of us? And obviously, you know, I'm up here. I think the answer is yes, but I just want to go through a little bit of that, situate us all in it. But first, right, we have seen this historical shift. We have seen an incredibly vast accumulation of capital, most of which is machines and raw materials all around the world. we have seen, this is from an earlier presentation, if you remember earlier lecture, we have seen more and more going to the rich and less going to wage workers as productivity continually expands and capital continues to operate. And I did want to just share um, this graph. It made some headlines in the Wall Street Journal and other newspapers, but I think last year was the first year on record where the top 10% account for more than 50% of spending in the economy. So just to think through that, it means half of the US economy is devoted to meeting the commodity needs of the top 10% of income earners, whereas less than 20% of the whole US economy is devoted to meeting the needs of the bottom 60%, broadly, let's say the working class. And so this is what we're seeing. In a sense, I will say, I think after World War II, often called like the golden years of capitalism, didn't perfectly fit this picture. But I think looking at back at recent history from 2025, we can say that, this image over the last handful of decades does look a lot like the picture Marx painted. And we can recognize a lot of the dynamics, like you said, in the Volcker shock, the creation of recession to bring wages down, these sorts of things. So I think there's sort of an interesting return to some of these logics that maybe you didn't see in the same way right after World War II. Not to say that Marx didn't have things to say about that period too, but okay. And with that, I wanted to jump into the end, chapters 24 and 25, the so-called original accumulation and the modern theory of colonization. And I'm going to be a little brief here, but not too brief. So, okay. So hopefully we now all have a sense of why capital keeps accumulating. We see it as a whole thing that has its own internal laws to regulate commodity prices and even keep wages low. And so we can understand sort of this endless cycle of accumulation, how it self-regulates, how it keeps going year after year after year. But there is still this question of where the original the original investment, the original accumulation comes from. How does this whole process get started? And that's sort of the question that Marx is going to address in this chapter. And he notes, that capitalists almost always have a myth here, right? They're like, oh, well, someone did all their pennies and they really accumulated a fortune. We even have a repeat in certain forms of this myth today, right? Where we can imagine that someone's hard work could somehow justify having even a $20 million fortune, not to say a $400 billion fortune, like multiple of these, rich entrepreneurs of the day have, right? There's false myth that somehow that extreme wealth, that extreme accumulation has some original moment where it was justified by hard work of the person involved. And that's the fairy tale that Marx wants to break in this chapter, basically. And he's basically going to do it by saying that actually, if you want to think about what's happening here, you do have to change your lens a little bit. You can't just think of how a little bit of money was accumulated over many years. You have to think about how the actual property relations of capitalism were instituted. And you have to understand that for most of history, people lived differently. So I took this image here. This is Bruegel the Elder, or maybe the younger, but it's peasants working on a feudal estate, and those peasants are oppressed, and they're exploited. But they also have a very different relationship to the land than someone who's working on a private landowner's farm or something, right? They treat the land sort of as their own. They have, maybe common areas they can go through. There's a different sense of what property is. So to get a little more specific, using the same example of medieval Europe, right? In medieval Europe, the king owns the whole country. That's the way it's set up, at least legally, right? But this ownership is more symbolic than anything real. The king is not actually in real control of most of the country. They can't actually just give it all away, et cetera, right? But there's a symbolic ownership of everything in the nation by the king. And then the nobility, who in a sense are more owners, are actually thought of just as stewards, right? But even the nobility do not actually control the land. The control of the land is regulated by basically a complex set of rights and duties. And the peasants who are tied to the land have both duties to work for the Lord, but also rights to work the land themselves, to collect wood in the common areas, maybe to graze animals in the common lands. So there's this very different set of what even property is. Like who has a right to do what is not has not been fixed, has not been crystallized in the form of capitalist private property. So I have this image, right? This is an image from around that time of the commons in England. And you can see here that despite being this beautiful sort of natural preserve, there are people here, and someone is grazing their donkeys, someone is collecting wood, people are maybe doing a little bit of hunting or foraging. And this was sort of the way life was in a sense lived back then, is you had a certain right to do all these things. In a sense, you had an ownership of the land, even though you were also subordinate. And this is what actually first brought Marx to politics. And so I did want to show this little clip from, if anyone's seen the movie The Young Karl Marx. It will be in German here, if it plays. Yeah, we're getting a little bit of play. But it's a German reading, actually, of one of Marx's early journalistic articles in Germany, where he's writing about the sort of terrors that the German aristocracy, new bourgeoisie, are doing in order to dispossess the peasants from the land. And so here there's a crew of peasants who are collecting wood, which is, just to say it, right, a basic necessity to live in these little cottages and stay warm through a winter in a place that's very, very cold. So it's part of what they have classically always done and had a right to do. I think there's even a little scene there, right, where the guy says, "Don't break that branch off the tree, because the living branches on the tree are the property of the landlord, but the dead branches on the ground are supposed to be free for anyone." And then you see the army running in here and basically beating up the peasants. And this is a very common situation that happens around this time period and is one of the early politicizing moments for Karl Marx. So I'll just let it play for a little bit here. Anyway, if anyone has not seen this movie, it is pretty fun. It's like totally a bromance movie. It's not that hard to watch. So what is going on, to just be a little less movie about it and a little more visual, I could say, map, a little more scientific. Basically, in this period in England, and Marx is writing about this, right? Huge portion of all the lands of England are enclosed and turned into private property in the sense that we now understand it today. One person has sort of full rights and control over the property. They fence it off. They say, no one can come on here, no one can collect any wood, etc. And in the map, everything that's red there was enclosed by an act of parliament, and the two green shadings indicate, that 70 or even 80, I think, percent, 50 to 70% was enclosed just by various means by the landlords over this period. And what does that produce? It produces this image here on the right? It produces this enclosure. You read about it in the book if you've gone through it. Often literally means the landlord comes and takes the cottages and bulldozes, there's no bulldozers, but destroys the cottages that people are living in. They have nowhere to live. And so you have all these peasant families showing up in the cities with everything they own and nowhere to go. You can see even right there on the right, the guy talking to the policeman, because he's not allowed to stay there in the snowy street for long. And so this is what's produced by the enclosure, right? It's a violent creation both of the private property and of the future working class. And I did want to just do a little bit of a more complex picture briefly. So I call this my smorgasbord slide. But in the middle, right, you have the production of a working class. But it's not just, if you go to that top right, that same image we saw, it's not just that the peasants are being pushed into the cities as dispossessed proletarians. It's not just that the usurers and the merchants' capital have become early industrial capital in the cities and thus are employing a new wage class in the cities. It's not just that these usurers and merchants and now the industrial capitalists are making huge fortunes. They're making the early fortunes of capital through the Atlantic slave trade and through various colonial ventures across the world. It's not just that those same colonial ventures are providing the raw materials for the industrial production in England. It's also that the absolutist monarchy is setting up a more definite control over the whole nation, instituting more national debt and monetary control, and thus also instituting national taxes that push every individual person, even a lot of the like small artisans and owners, to have to become commodity sellers because they need money to pay the taxes, right? So it's this comprehensive system of forces that's producing, on the one hand, the dispossessed proletariat working class, and on the other hand, the early fortunes that employ them, that are the early fortunes of capital. And so to quote Marx here, right? If, according to Augier, money comes into the world with natural bloodstains on one cheek, capital is born with blood and dirt oozing from every pore. And so that is just the breaking of the fairy tale, right? That actually what is going on, why are these fortunes accumulated? Well, because of a violent process of dispossession and institution of a new type of private property, the so-called original accumulation that occurred in this period for England and in previous times, or later times in other countries. Sorry, I'll get into that. I did want to sort of briefly mention, if you remember this slide from a previous lecture, right? This is from the Working Day chapter. But Marx actually talked earlier in the book about how from 1350 to 1700, the laws and the power of the state was used not to set a minimum wage, not to reduce the hours workers work, but to force them to work, to turn them into a working class, even though people were not, not willing. And so there's all these, this is also detailed a little bit in this chapter, right? All these vagabond laws where if you're caught without a job wandering a street, well, first offense, we cut off half your ear. Second offense, you can become a slave for 2 years to whoever accuses you. Third offense, we cut off your head. Like it's that sort of brutal anti-vagabond laws that push people who used to be peasants with their own home and their own rights to the land into being wage workers over generations of time. And it's not until, right, the development of industrial capitalism and really the moment where capital becomes powerful enough that merely the force of economic relations is enough to push the worker to sell the entire active period of their lives for the price of their normal means of subsistence, that we have the rolling back of these old laws and actually the institution at the end here, right, of the factory laws that actually constrain the working day, that say you can't be forced to work for 18 hours in a factory. The working day is 12 hours, it's 10 hours, and in our modern day, often 8 hours. And so it's this early moment that Marx talked about earlier that he's now re-looking at again from this perspective of original accumulation. And I did want to do a quick jump back in a sense, if people are willing to go there with me, and just say, this is a quote from the original accumulation chapter. Once the capitalist production process has become highly organized, it broke all the resistance it encountered. The continuous generation of a relative surplus population kept the law of labor's supply and demand, and thus wages, on a track that fit with capital's valorization requirements. And the silent force of economic relations sealed the capitalist domination over his workers. Direct extra-economic violence is still used, of course, but only in exceptional cases. And I did want to just maybe take a moment and see if anyone wants to try to, in a sense it's an easy answer, but in a sense it's a big answer. Answer the question of this sort of section. Like what is happening here? Why is direct economic violence only used in exceptional cases now? And do you have the mic? Is that something? Cool. Thank you. Want to start with Mike?
And the silent force is a new translation. The old translation was mute compulsion. And basically, if you do not own capital, you are forced to work for a capitalist. And everyone just accepts that. It's not necessary to use violence except in exceptional cases, when the contradictions increase, or when you're doing direct stealing, direct expropriation, which is still occurring when capitalism steals from nature, for instance, or Trump's idea to steal the oil from Venezuela.
is because we don't have a plot of land to grow our own shit. And we can only get that stuff from capitalists. And so, yeah, I mean, you don't have to have a policeman to make you work. You just work because otherwise you wouldn't eat or have a house.
Yeah, well said on both counts. Um, oh yeah, some more.
And as that process comes, it becomes more invisible. It becomes like this is just the water we're swimming in. And somehow in here, it makes me think of, I don't know whose quote this is, but fascism is imperialism coming home. So in the extremities of that's where the violence continues. And in our disrupted world we're living in now, I think we're seeing the rise of it again.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's do one last one, and then we can move forward.
Um, well, and I guess just to build off of that, and I remember the last chapter is about colonization, that essentially this sort of primitive accumulation has to happen in various places around the world. So pretty much you create a global market. So the violence is still, used there while things are more invisible over here.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, all good answers. And I'll just note because I heard in a couple answers, yes, there's still original accumulation happening in various places even up till today, which is right, direct extra economic violence. But then in the more centers of sort of, where there's already a long established capitalist market, generally you don't see that. You don't see direct extra economic violence. You see economic violence, which is, you can't eat if you don't have a job. You can't have a home if you don't have a job. And I think you mentioned, right? Oh, well, if we had a little plot of land, but even that, right? If you think we all have the fantasy, but also think about it, it's like, well, what? I'm going to grow wheat on my little plot of land and then sell the wheat to buy a cell phone, which I sort of need to live a modern life, or like to buy, all these things that are other commodities. Well, the wheat you grow on your little plot of land will be like $4 worth. So what are you going to do, right? Like you live in a world in which capital has determined the general overall system of production. And even having a little plot of land, you just become like a little subsistence peasant that do exist all over the world today. Um, and so it's mute, and it's not just forcing you to work. It's like, well, even if you got a little bit of capital, right, it wouldn't be concentrated, it wouldn't be accumulated enough, like we described, to really face up against the titans of modern capitalism. Um, Maybe a bit of a detour. But I did have one last slide, which is a little bit maybe a strange answer to where is original accumulation still happening today. But I do think one of the most obvious examples, right, just totally clear cut, is the division up of the ex-USSR after the fall of the USSR. I mean, so here's, a bunch of productive apparatuses, land, companies, factories that effectively do not exist in our sense of private property. And private property is brought back in, creating the fortunes of all these men, right? The Russian oligarchs in the 80s and 90s, which is still a legacy we're, in a sense, historically facing today. There's many other examples of this, right? From just general sort of colonial ventures that continue today, also even to things like, the privatization of education and healthcare, right? Which are classically, you know, in a sense, were historically, at least in recent history, somewhat public goods and are being turned into preserves for the rich to make money, just the way that the common lands were enclosed to be turned into preserves for the sheep to make the wool that made the rich men money, right? So all of these things are again, forms of original accumulation that still exist today. Um, but I also think one of the important things to draw from this chapter um, is to go back to this sort of theme and images we've used a couple of times, right? Which is just that, just like original accumulation was actually a violent and historical event, right? A transition to socialism will also require some sort of transformation in the basic rights and duties of property in society, right? It's gonna require transformation what it means for there to be property in society. And that is a form of direct extra economic violence, at least in some part, right? That doesn't mean killing people. I won't say that, but it's going to mean applying forces that aren't just totally within the rules of the economy. And that requires working class organization. It requires people coming together. It requires forming a real historical force. And so I just want to note that this picture of how capitalism was created and new property relations were sort of instituted is also in reverse, you could say, right, a picture of how you would create a new type of society. And I think Marx has a fun note in there, right, where he says the first process took a really long time because you had to expropriate millions of little peasants. But the second process can happen much faster because there's only a handful of people who own a lot of the wealth. And so that's, that's why we need to organize, because it's not going to just be some economic shift or some slight shift within the economic rules and political rules. It's going to take some direct extra economic force to change what society looks like. Okay. And with that, that's the end. So happy to take some questions or yeah. It's okay if there's none too, huh? Okay, great. Let's call it.